The heavy oak door of the church groaned shut behind me, a sound as final and hollow as a coffin lid closing on the last of the light. Instantly, every head in the sacred hall turned, a slow, synchronized swivel of condemnation. I stood frozen in the narthex, the scent of old incense and lilies suddenly thick and cloying like a funeral. A sea of disapproving faces, faces I had known my entire life, stared back at me. My neighbors, members of my bridge club, women I'd volunteered with at the hospital bake sale just last spring. Their whispers began, a dry, insidious rustling like dead leaves skittering across pavement, carrying judgment down the long center aisle. At the very front, bathed in the soft, colored light of the stained glass Christ, my son Mark refused to look at me. He stood ramrod straight by the gleaming marble font, his shoulders set in a line of pure tension. His wife, Sarah, clutched their baby, my grandson, Leo, to her chest with a fierce, protective grip, as if I were not a grandmother come to witness a blessing, but a plague carrier, a blight upon their perfect family portrait. She had barred me from my own grandson's christening, and yet, here I was. I had come anyway. My heart hammered against the cage of my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings. Shame, hot and prickly, crawled up my neck, but beneath it, a stubborn root of defiance held me fast. I was a pariah, a ghost at the feast they hadn't invited me to. I remained in the church's entryway, separated from the pews by a thick, crimson velvet rope, a sinner quite literally kept from the sanctuary. Sarah's glare was a physical blow, cold and sharp as an icicle. With movements that were almost violent in their precision, she adjusted the delicate white lace of Leo's christening gown, her knuckles white. Mark's shoulders were hunched, a posture I knew as well as my own reflection. It was the same way he stood at age 10 when he had to confess to breaking Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rosebush with a stray baseball. He was trapped, utterly and miserably trapped, and somehow I was the cause. But the truth was, I had to be here. I had to see my grandson, to be in the same room as him on this holy day, even if it meant watching from the shadows like a thief. The organ music, which should have been a sound of soaring joy, swelled into a majestic, booming fanfare that only magnified my profound isolation. The priest, Father Michael, a man whose kind eyes and gentle demeanor I'd known for 30 years, stepped forward to the altar. He had presided over my husband Robert's funeral, his words a balm on my shattered heart. Today, his presence felt like another form of judgment. He smiled warmly at the small congregation, then at the proud parents. His eyes, crinkling at the corners, scanned the pews, and then they found me. They found me, lingering in the doorway, a shadow in the house of God. His smile didn't just falter. It vanished, replaced by a flicker of something I couldn't immediately name. It wasn't anger, but something far more complex. Pity? No confusion? Perhaps. But beneath it all was a flash of deep, unsettling recognition. He knew. But what could he possibly know? He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the heavy prayer book in his hands. He opened it, his fingers tracing the gilded edge of a page, but his focus was gone. His eyes darted back to me, then to Sarah's rigid back, then back to me again. The air in the church shifted, growing heavy and charged like the moments before a lightning strike. With a soft, decisive thud, Father Michael closed the book. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the expectant silence. The organist, a sweet woman named Beatrice who always asked after my garden, saw the cue and her fingers stilled on the keys. The music died away, leaving a void so absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Father Michael looked at Mark and Sarah, his face now a mask of solemn resolve. His voice, when he spoke, echoed in the sudden, hallowed quiet, reaching every corner of the church. "I'm sorry," he said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "We cannot proceed." Every person in that church, every last soul swiveled to stare directly at me. The collective weight of their gaze was a physical force, pressing me back against the heavy door. The air didn't just crackle. It fractured with 1,000 unspoken questions. Mark, my son, finally turned, his face a contorted mask of disbelief and rising fury. "What? Father, what are you talking about? This is my son's christening." Sarah went deathly pale, a stark contrast to her dark hair. Her knuckles, already white, seemed to glow as she clutched baby Leo tighter. But Father Michael wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking directly at me, and in his eyes I saw not the condemnation I had expected, but a terrible, heartbreaking sorrow. It was a sorrow that seemed to understand everything, a sorrow that went beyond this single, awful moment. It was a sorrow that seemed to know the secrets I carried, and even the ones I didn't know I was carrying myself. And in that moment of shared, sorrowful eye contact, a dreadful certainty bloomed in my chest. This wasn't just about me crashing a party I wasn't invited to. This was about something else entirely. A secret so monumental, so corrosive, it had the power to stop a holy sacrament in its tracks. The silence stretched on, thin and brittle as old lace. It felt like standing on a frozen lake, hearing the first ominous crack spread out from beneath my feet, knowing the ice was about to give way. My son's words from 2 nights ago, the words that had sent me here in the first place, echoed in my head with torturous clarity. Mom, you can't come. Please, just don't. His voice over the phone had been strained, stripped of all warmth, all familiarity. It was the voice of a stranger reading from a script. Why, Mark? What have I done that is so terrible? I'd pleaded, my own voice cracking, the sound of my own heartbreak foreign and pathetic to my ears. I was begging my own child for an explanation. There had been a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line, filled only with the sound of his shallow breathing. In the background, I could hear Sarah whispering to him, her words sharp and indistinct, like the angry buzzing of hornets. I couldn't make them out, but I could feel their sting. It's for the best, Mom, he finally said, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow, devoid of any real meaning. Sarah feels. We just need some space right now. It's a complicated time. Complicated. That was the word. The word they had used to build a wall between us, brick by mortared brick. It hadn't happened all at once. It was a slow, insidious construction, so gradual I almost didn't notice until I was completely walled out, peering through a tiny grate at the life of my own son. It began shortly after the wedding. I'd call, full of cheer, and Sarah would answer, her voice a confection of syrupy sweetness with a razor-sharp edge of impatience. Oh, Eleanor, hi. Mark's just heading into a meeting right now. Can he call you back? He rarely did. I'd show up with a casserole, my time-honored excuse to lay eyes on my son, and she'd meet me at the door, taking the Pyrex dish with a smile that never reached her eyes. That's so thoughtful of you. We're actually just on our way out, but thank you. I was never invited in. Not once. The threshold of their home became a border I was not permitted to cross. I tried to reason with myself, to silence the growing panic in my heart. You're being a paranoid old woman. Eleanor, of course, they're busy, they're newlyweds. Building a life, you are the mother-in-law. A relic from his past life, you need to give them room to breathe. So I backed away, I stopped calling as often I waited for the phone to ring. An act of futility that became its own special kind of torture. I filled my sprawling, silent days with furious gardening and long hours volunteering at the library. Anything to quiet the relentless ache of loneliness that had taken up permanent residence in my chest since my husband, Robert, passed away 3 years ago. Oh, Robert, he would have known what to do. He would never have stood for this. He would have driven over to Mark's office, sat him down, man to man, and sorted it all out in 5 minutes flat over a cup of coffee. He had a way of cutting through the nonsense, but I was alone. Adrift, navigating this strange new emotional territory where my own son felt like a foreign country with closed borders. I didn't know the language anymore. I didn't understand the customs. Then came the pregnancy announcement. Mark had called me himself, his voice bursting with a joy so pure and overwhelming that I hadn't heard its like in years. You're going to be a grandma, Mom, he'd shouted into the phone, and for one glorious, shining moment, the wall between us crumbled into dust. I wept with happiness, my hand flying to my mouth. I pictured a tiny, perfect hand wrapped around my finger, a little face that was a perfect blend of my handsome son and the beautiful woman he loved. I imagined reading bedtime stories in the old rocking chair, the one my own mother had rocked me in. I imagined the smell of baking cookies, the sound of tiny feet on my hardwood floors. I thought this baby, this miracle, would be the bridge to bring us all back together. How tragically wrong I was. The baby didn't become a bridge. The baby became the fortress. Sarah's having a very delicate pregnancy, Mom, Mark would explain, his voice taking on that now familiar strained quality. The doctor said she needs to be in a completely low-stress environment, and apparently I was the primary source of all stress. Every suggestion I made, every offer of help, was treated as a source of toxic pressure. Offering to help decorate the nursery? Thanks, Mom, but Sarah has a very specific vision. She's working with a designer. It was a lie. I'd seen her buying paint at the hardware store. Knitting a baby blanket from the softest merino wool? That's so sweet of you, but we've already bought all organic, hypoallergenic bedding from a specialty store in the city. My attempts at connection were systematically twisted into acts of intrusion. I was no longer a future grandmother, a helping hand. I was a meddling, overbearing old woman. The pain of it was a constant, dull throb behind my breastbone. What had I done? What was my great crime to make my daughter-in-law dislike me so intensely, so actively? I spent countless sleepless nights replaying every conversation, every interaction since they'd met, searching for my misstep, my fatal error. Was it the time I'd innocently mentioned that Mark used to love my lasagna, a dish he'd requested every year for his birthday since he was 6? Did she take that as a criticism of her own cooking? Was it when I offered her my mother's rocking chair, a precious family heirloom I had lovingly restored myself? Did she see it not as a gift from the heart, but as me trying to force my family's history onto hers? It was like walking through a minefield in the dark. I had no idea where the mines were buried, and every step I took seemed to result in an explosion. Back in the suffocating stillness of the church, the silence finally broke. Sarah spoke, her voice a low, vicious hiss directed at the priest, but pitched for everyone in the first 10 pews to hear. How dare you? This is a holy day for our son, for our family. You have no right to disrupt it. She shifted Leo in her arms, turning her body to shield him from my sight completely. It was a deliberate, calculated, cruel gesture, and it cut me deeper than any shouted insult could. It was a physical denial of my existence. Mark stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Sarah's arm, his body forming a barrier. Father Michael, with all due respect, my wife is right. If there's some kind of issue, we can discuss it after the service. In private. Please just continue. Father Michael shook his head slowly, his kind face etched with an unshakable resolve. No, Mark. I cannot. God's house must be a house of truth. A christening is a welcome into a community of faith, a family of believers. It cannot and will not be performed while there is such a deep and painful wound in this family. A wound, he added, his voice dropping slightly, that is being actively ignored, allowed to fester. He took a deliberate step down from the altar. The very air grew thick, heavy with the promise of a coming storm. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to flee this public humiliation, to escape the hundreds of eyes that were now boring into me, judging me, finding me guilty of a crime I didn't even know I'd committed. But my feet felt like they were nailed to the marble floor, held there by the priest's unwavering gaze and a desperate, flickering ember of hope that the truth, whatever it was about to set me free. Or destroy me completely. I wasn't sure which would be worse. My mind, frantic for an answer, raced back to the day Leo was born. I'd seen the announcement not through a joyful phone call, but on social media, like any other distant acquaintance or old high school friend. A professionally lit picture of a tiny, red-faced, sleeping baby with the caption, "Welcome to the world, Leo James." Our hearts are so full. My own heart had shattered into a million pieces. They hadn't even called me to tell me I had a grandson. Swallowing my pride and my tears, I called Mark. My voice was thick, but I forced a brightness into it I did not feel. He's beautiful, honey. Just beautiful. Congratulations. Thanks, Mom, he'd said, his tone hurried and distracted. In the background, I could hear the happy chatter of other people. It's been crazy here. Can I come see him? I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I can bring dinner. You and Sarah must be exhausted. Not today, Mom, he'd said quickly. Sarah and the baby need to rest. The hospital has really strict visitor policies because of flu season. I knew it was a lie. I had volunteered on that very maternity ward for 5 years after Robert died. I knew the policies by heart. They allowed 2 visitors at a time, plus grandparents. But arguing would only make it worse. Of course, I stammered, the hope draining out of me. I understand. Just Just tell me when never came. The weeks turned into a month, then two. I watched my grandson grow up in two-dimensional images that Sarah posted online. Pictures of him with her smiling parents. Pictures of him with her giggling friends. Pictures of him being held by smiling, cooing strangers at a coffee shop. Never with me. Each photo was a fresh stab to the heart. He was growing, changing, his newborn features softening into the face of a baby, and I was missing all of it. I was being systematically, deliberately erased from my own family story. The final, most brutal blow was the christening invitation that never arrived in my mailbox. I'd held out hope until the very last week. When I finally got the courage to call Mark and ask, his strained voice delivering the verdict that I was not welcome, that my presence was not wanted, a part of me died. It was a grief sharper and more bewildering than when I lost Robert. That was a clean loss, a swift act of God. This was a slow, deliberate amputation, performed without anesthetic by my own son. So I had decided to come anyway. Not to make a scene, not to cause a fight. My plan had been simple. Slip into the very back pew, hidden behind a pillar, watch the blessing from afar, and then leave before anyone even noticed I was there. I just needed to be in the same room as my grandson on his special day. I needed to offer up my own silent prayer for his health and happiness, even if I wasn't allowed to stand with his family. I had underestimated Sarah's hypervigilance, and I had certainly, profoundly, underestimated Father Michael. Now here he was, walking with measured, determined steps down the center aisle, his black robes swishing against the stone. He didn't stop at the pews where Mark and Sarah stood. He walked right up to them, their little family unit, a defensive triangle against the world, against me. The guests murmured, their curiosity turning into a palpable, hungry tension. Sarah, the priest said, his voice soft but carrying with immense authority in the stillness, "Look at Eleanor. Look at your husband's mother." Sarah's chin jutted out in a gesture of pure defiance. She refused, keeping her eyes fixed on the stained glass window of St. Francis above the altar. "She is not welcome here," she stated, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and something else. Something that sounded an awful lot like fear. Why on earth was she so afraid of me? And why is that? Father Michael pressed gently, his tone patient but unyielding. "What sin has this woman committed that is so grievous she must be cast out? Not just from your home, but from the house of God on the day her only grandson is brought before him?" Mark found his voice, a raw, angry thing. He stepped between his wife and the priest, a human shield. "Father, this is not the time or the place. This is a private family matter. Is there any matter more public than one brought into a church?" Father Michael counted, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, making them all participants in this drama. "A family is a small church, Mark. A domestic church. And yours is in turmoil. A poison has taken root. And if we do not expose it to the light, right now, it will fester and destroy everything you hold dear." Poison. The word hung in the sacred air, vile and potent. Was I the poison? Was my love for my son, my deep, aching longing for my grandson, so toxic? I wrapped my arms around my waist, a sudden, profound chill seeping deep into my bones that had nothing to do with the cool air of the old stone church. I felt the weight of every single stare, the heat of their judgment, the finality of their condemnation. I saw it in the eyes of my neighbors, people I'd shared coffee and gossip with for 20 years. They were looking at me as if they'd never known me at all, as if I were a stranger who had revealed a monstrous face. Maybe they hadn't known me. Maybe, I thought with a terrifying lurch in my stomach, I hadn't even known myself. Had I become some kind of monster without even realizing it? A wicked mother-in-law from a fairy tale? My thoughts, desperate for an anchor, drifted to Sarah's family. I'd only met them a handful of times, at the engagement party, the wedding. Her parents were pleasant enough, quiet, mousy people who seemed to live entirely in their vibrant daughter's shadow. They always seemed nervous around me, their smiles a little too bright, their handshakes a little too quick. But I remembered her brother, David, much more clearly. I'd met him properly only once, at the engagement party at their country club. He had been impossibly charming, with a quick, easy smile and the same dark, expressive, almond-shaped eyes as Sarah. He'd made a point to come over and talk to me, asking about Robert, about my life, with a genuine interest that was so rare in the young. I remembered thinking how much he looked like a movie star from the 40s. He had died in a horrific car accident just a couple of years ago, a terrible, senseless tragedy. I remembered how utterly devastated Sarah had been, a grief so profound it seemed to hollow her out. I'd sent a mass card and a heartfelt sympathy note, and I'd held her as she wept at the wake. "You're so kind, Eleanor," she'd said then, her eyes wet and sincere. "Thank you for being here." There was no poison between us on that day, only shared humanity. What on earth had happened between that grief-stricken hug and this vast, unbridgeable chasm of hatred? I remember now a conversation I had with David that night at the party. He'd been talking about his future. "I've had some health scares," he'd admitted with a wry, self-deprecating smile. "Nothing to worry about now, all sorted. But it makes you think about legacy, you know? I want kids. A whole mess of them. More than anything." The memory was so vivid, so poignant. A young man full of life, talking about the children he would never have. What could any of this have to do with today? How could you even begin to guess the unbelievable truth at the heart of this story? Father Michael's voice pulled me sharply back to the horrifying present. He was speaking directly to Sarah again, his tone filled with a deep, paternal compassion that made my own heart ache. "Sarah, I have known you since you were a little girl in pigtails. I gave you your first communion. I was there when you mourned your brother. I know the goodness that is in your heart, but I also know the terrible weight of the secret you are carrying." Secret. There it was again. The key that would unlock this whole nightmare. Sarah flinched as if he had struck her. Her eyes, now wide with sheer panic, darted from the priest to Mark, and then, for the first time since I'd entered the church, her gaze flew to meet mine. And in that fleeting, terrified glance, I saw it all laid bare. Terror, suffocating guilt, and a desperate, silent plea for what? Understanding? Forgiveness? Mercy? I had no idea. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice so thin it was barely audible. But her body was a symphony of betrayal. She was trembling so violently that the baby in her arms, my grandson Leo, began to stir and let out a soft, questioning whimper. "Don't you?" Father Michael asked softly, his voice full of sorrow. "Don't you think your husband, the man you vowed to honor and cherish, deserves to know the truth? Don't you think this innocent child deserves to be christened into a family that is whole and honest before God?" Mark looked utterly, painfully bewildered. He was a man caught in a play where everyone else had a script but him. He glanced from his wife's ashen, crumbling face to the priest's solemn one. "The truth about what?" "Sarah, for God's sake, what is he talking about?" He reached for her, a gesture of comfort, but she recoiled from his touch as if burned, pulling the baby even closer to her chest. "It's nothing, Mark. He's confused. He's an old man," she stammered, the lie so transparent, so fragile and pathetic that it was painful to witness. Everyone in that church, from the choir loft to the back pews, could see it. The secret was no longer a secret. It was a living, breathing thing in the room now, writhing on the floor between them, ugly and exposed. And then Father Michael did something I never, ever expected. He turned away from them and walked towards me, his resolute footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. He stopped directly in front of the crimson velvet rope that separated me, the outcast, from the rest of the congregation. With a steady, deliberate hand, he unhooked the heavy brass clasp from the wall. He let the rope fall to the side with a soft thud. The path was clear. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle but firm as granite. "Come. Stand with your family." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. It was a release. My knees felt weak. I took a hesitant, shuffling step forward, then another, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I walked down that long, silent aisle, a walk of shame that had suddenly transformed into something else. The eyes of the congregation followed my every move, their expressions no longer just judgmental, but now filled with a dawning, rapt curiosity. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a central player in a drama I still didn't understand. When I reached the front of the church, I stopped a few feet away from my son and his wife. The space between us felt like a mile-wide canyon, crackling with unspoken words and devastating truths. Sarah was staring at me now, her face a ravaged mess of conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, a flickering pilot light, but it was being rapidly drowned by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated panic. Mark looked at me, his own confusion warring with a flicker of his old, familiar love. I could see the battle in his eyes. He was torn in two, his heart caught in a vicious tug-of-war between his wife and his mother. "Mom," he started, his voice a raw plea for answers. "Tell him, Sarah," Father Michael urged, his voice resonating with divine and earthly authority. "Tell him why you have been so desperately afraid of his mother. Tell him why you couldn't bear to have her near your son. The truth. Here. Now." Sarah let out a choked, strangled sob. The sound was so full of agony it startled me. This wasn't the sound of a cruel, manipulative woman being cornered. It was the sound of a heart not just breaking, but shattering into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at Mark, her beautiful face ruined, her eyes swimming in tears. "I'm sorry," she wept, her words fractured and torn. "Mark, I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what?" Mark demanded, his patience finally snapping like a frayed rope. "Sorry for treating my mother like a piece of garbage for 2 years? Sorry for turning our lives into a fortress? What in God's name is going on?" Sarah just shook her head, unable to speak, her sobs shaking her entire body. Little Leo, disturbed by the violence of his mother's grief, began to cry in earnest, his small, piercing wails filling the cavernous, silent church. And in that moment, as Sarah tried to soothe him, rocking him back and forth and murmuring to him through her own tears, I saw it. I don't know why I hadn't seen it in the flat, curated photos online. Maybe the angle was never right, or maybe my own grief and anger had clouded my vision, preventing me from seeing what was plainly there. But now, seeing the baby's little face contorted in a cry, his features unobscured, I saw it as clearly as if it were carved in the stone of the altar. Little Leo looked nothing like my son Mark. He didn't have Mark's chin, or his nose, or the telltale shape of his ears. He had Sarah's dark, silky hair, yes, but the shape of his eyes, those wide, almond-shaped eyes that were now wet with tears. The elegant curve of his brow. The specific set of his tiny, crying mouth. It was her brother. He was the spitting image of David. The realization hit me not like a thought, but like a physical blow, a punch to the solar plexus that stole all the air from my lungs. My breath hitched. My vision swam. I looked from the crying baby to Sarah's tormented face, and then to my son's confused one, and suddenly the entire painful history of the past 2 years clicked into place with horrifying, devastating clarity. Her fear, her secrecy, her desperate, cruel need to keep me away. It was never about my lasagna. It was never about the rocking chair. It was because she knew. She knew I had met David, that I had spoken to him, that his face was etched in my memory. She was terrified that I, of all people, would be the one to see the resemblance. She was terrified I would be the one to uncover her soul-shattering secret. The baby in her arms wasn't my biological grandson. He wasn't Robert's legacy. He wasn't Mark's son. A wave of vertigo washed over me, and I reached out a trembling hand to steady myself on the cold, polished wood of a pew. The floor seemed to tilt violently beneath my feet. All the pain of the past 2 years, the loneliness, the confusion, the feeling of being rejected and unloved, it all coalesced into this one shocking, paradigm-shifting revelation. The cruelty, the isolation. It hadn't been about me at all. It had been about this. This monumental, life-altering lie. "He's not my son, is he?" The words were Mark's, but they were spoken in a dead, hollow whisper. All the anger, all the fire had been drained out of him, replaced by a dawning, vacant horror. He had seen it too, in the clear, unforgiving light of the church, with the truth hanging heavy and poisonous in the air. He finally saw what had been right in front of him all along. Sarah's sobs became a gut-wrenching, animal wail of pure despair. She collapsed onto the front pew as if her bones had dissolved, cradling the crying baby, her body heaving. "He's David's," she finally confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "He's my brother's son." The confession landed in the silent church like a bomb, the fallout instant and catastrophic. The remaining guests gasped, a collective, shocked intake of breath. Mark stared at her, his face utterly blank, his mind unable to process the new reality. He looked like a man who had been told the sky was, and had always been, green. What? He managed to choke out, a single word full of a universe of pain. How is that even possible? Through her tears, the whole tragic story tumbled out, fragmented and raw. After David's tragic death, his distraught fiancée had discovered she was pregnant. Overwhelmed by grief and a future she couldn't face, she told Sarah she couldn't raise the child. Sarah, heartbroken over the loss of her beloved brother and desperate to keep a piece of him alive in the world, had made a secret pact with her. Sarah and Mark would adopt the baby and raise him as their own. But then, weeks later, the fiancée had changed her mind, vanished without a trace, and left Sarah with nothing but a broken promise and a desperate, impossible idea that had taken root in her grieving heart. He had his sperm frozen. Sarah wept, her face buried in Leo's soft white blanket. Years ago. Before the chemo. For the cancer he beat when he was 20. He always wanted to be a father. She had gone to a fertility clinic in another state. She had used her dead brother's sample. She had gotten pregnant with her own nephew. She had carried his child, her brother's child, for 9 months, all while letting my son believe he was the father. I was going to tell you, Mark, she cried, looking up at him, her face a ruin of tears and smeared mascara. I swear to God, I was. But I was so scared. I fell in love with him the moment I knew he existed. And I loved you so much, and I thought we could just be a family. A real family. But then your mom. She met David that one time. She talked to him. I knew she'd see it in Leo's face. I knew she would figure it out. I just wanted to protect us. To protect him, she sobbed, clutching the baby. I never meant to be so cruel to you, Eleanor. I was just so scared of losing everything. My own pain, the sharp personal sting of 2 years of rejection, was suddenly washed away by an unexpected and overwhelming wave of pity. Pity for this broken young woman, so consumed by grief and fear that she had constructed an elaborate prison of lies around herself and the people she claimed to love. And pity, oh God, such profound pity for my son, whose boundless joy at becoming a father had been built on a foundation of the most devastating deception imaginable. Mark stumbled back a step, then another, before sinking onto the padded kneeler behind him. He put his head in his hands, his body curling in on itself as if to ward off a physical blow. He didn't say a word. The silence was his answer. It was the sound of a man's world, his life, his future, his very identity, shattering around him. Father Michael stepped forward into the breach. The christening is postponed, he announced to the stunned, silent congregation. I ask that you all please leave now, and to leave with a prayer in your hearts for this family. There was a rustle of movement, the scraping of shoes on stone, the embarrassed, hushed whispers as people filed out, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. They were eager to escape the raw, exposed wound of our family, to get to their cars and begin the gossiping. They left the 4 of us alone in the vast, empty church, me, my son, his wife, the baby who was at the center of it all, and the priest who had forced the truth into the light. I didn't know what to do. Every maternal instinct I possessed told me to go to Mark, to put my arms around my boy as I had when he was a child with a skinned knee. But this was a wound I couldn't fix with a kiss and a bandage. This was a soul-deep laceration. Sarah was still weeping, her heartbroken cries echoing in the unnerving silence of the empty sanctuary. Little Leo, as if sensing the storm had passed, had finally quieted, his small face tear-streaked and peaceful as he slept in her arms, utterly oblivious to the devastation he represented. Slowly, cautiously, I walked over to the pew where Sarah sat huddled and broken. I didn't say anything. I just sat down beside her, leaving a small, respectful space between us. For a long time, we just sat there, surrounded by the scent of old wood and candle wax. The 3 of us, broken in our own unique ways, Mark a silent, grieving statue a few feet away. Finally, I found my voice. It was softer, steadier than I expected. He is a beautiful baby, Sarah. She flinched, then looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen with shame. She had clearly expected my anger, my accusations, my hatred. She didn't expect this small, simple truth. "He has his uncle's eyes," I said quietly, the words tasting strange on my tongue. A fresh wave of gut-wrenching sobs shook her. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor," she whispered, the words thick with phlegm and tears. "I've been a monster to you. You were afraid," I said, and as I spoke the words, I realized they were true. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was too soon, the wound too fresh for that. But it was the beginning of an attempt to understand. Secrets make people do monstrous things. I looked over at my son. He hadn't moved. His back was still to us, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. "He needs you, Sarah," I said, my voice firm. "More than ever, he needs you to be his wife. The lies are over. Now the hard part begins." She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, then at the back of her husband's head. She nodded, a small, jerky, uncertain movement. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind you take when you're about to dive into icy, unknown water. Then she stood up on trembling legs and walked to Mark. She knelt on the hard floor beside him, the baby nestled between them. I couldn't hear what she was saying. Her words were a low, desperate murmur, but I saw her place a tentative hand on his back. He didn't pull away. He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away. It was a start. Father Michael came and sat where Sarah had been, the wood of the pew still warm. "I am sorry for the public nature of this, Eleanor," he said softly, "but the lie was a cancer, poisoning them both. It had to be cut out. You knew?" I asked, looking at his tired, kind face. He nodded. "Sarah came to me in confession weeks ago, tormented by her conscience. The seal of the confessional is absolute, of course. I could not speak of it. But nor could I, in good conscience, perform a sacrament based on such a profound and fractured foundation. I prayed she would find the courage to tell the truth herself. Sometimes," he added, his gaze resting on the couple kneeling by the altar, a tableau of modern tragedy, "God requires us to help people find their courage." I looked at Leo, sleeping so peacefully, so innocent. A child born of grief and deception. A child who had inadvertently caused so much pain. My heart ached with a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't the grandson I had been expecting, not a continuation of my bloodline with Robert. He was something else entirely. Something infinitely more complicated. But as I looked at his perfect, tiny face, a fierce, unexpected wave of love washed over me. It wasn't the simple, instinctual love of biology. It felt like something deeper, something harder earned. It was the love of choice. Later that afternoon, after hours of tears and painful, halting conversation in the strained quiet of my son's house, I sat in the old rocking chair. The one I'd offered Sarah months ago, which she had quietly, shamefully retrieved from the dusty corner of the garage. Mark and Sarah were in the kitchen, their voices low and strained, taking the first monumental steps of figuring out what came next. Sarah had finally, after a long, tense silence, turned to me, her voice hoarse and fragile. Would you like to hold him?" And she had placed the warm, heavy bundle of Leo in my arms. He was heavier than I'd imagined, a solid, real presence. He smelled of milk and baby powder and innocence. He stirred in his sleep, his little mouth working, his tiny fists curled. I looked down at him, this child who had caused so much pain, this child who was the living legacy of a brother's undying love and a sister's bottomless grief. He wasn't the child of my child, but he was, undeniably, a child in my family. And he needed a grandmother. "Hello, Leo," I whispered, my own tears finally falling, hot and silent, down my cheeks. They weren't tears of sorrow or anger or even pity. They were tears of a strange, complex, cathartic release. "I'm your Grandma Eleanor. It's so very, very nice to finally meet you." The lies were over. The hurt was still there, a raw and tender thing that would take a long time to heal. But for the first time in 2 long years, the wall was gone. We weren't whole and we weren't fixed. Far from it. But we were together in the wreckage, and that, I realized as I began to gently rock, is where a family truly begins to rebuild.